I'm Todd. I'm CEO and founder of VREAL. We're a VR startup here in Seattle. I want to talk a little bit about social and VR and how those things intersect. And to start with, I thought, when you're talking about the future, I always like to go back and sort of look at the past. Everyone knows what video games are, but I like to go way, way, way back before that. And see how's that going to relate to our virtual and augmented future. So, the past. Social games actually go back to the dawn of civilization. The moment we got agriculture, we had role specialization, people started playing games. And one of the very first board games that historians have identified is this game called Senet. It's an Egyptian game. It goes back about 5,000 years. And it's called the game of passing, and it's actually structured as a journey to the afterlife or the underworld, if you want to think of it that way. This is an actual one that exists in the Brooklyn Museum from 1300 BC. And it's actually a beautiful piece of art. Interestingly, you might see games like in game stores that say they're Senet. That's actually a version that was invented in the 1940s by Parker Brothers. The historians don't really know what the rules of Senet was because, Egyptian hieroglyphics, it's very difficult to interpret the game rules. So we don't actually know how it was played. This is a tomb painting from 2300 BC that shows two people playing Senet. One of the reasons we don't know the rules is the Egyptians had this style where everything was from the side, and so we cannot really see what the layout of the pieces were on the board. But this is really interesting. This is the first recorded instance of two players trash-talking each other. Because if you can read Egyptian, which I can't, but I looked it up on Google, they're actually, the guy on the left is saying, be happy, my heart, I'm going to cause you to see the game taken away. And the person on the right is saying, you speak as one weak of tongue, for passing, which is what they called Senet, is mine. I'm going to win. So gamers have actually been trash-talking each other since the beginning of time. I thought it was pretty cool. I told you Senet is a two-player game. This is Nefertiti in a tomb painting, and this style of tomb painting was very common. And a lot of the Egyptologists couldn't work out why, right? It's a two-player game. There's no one on the other side of the board. Well, after more research, they found that actually you could play the game against an invisible adversary that represented your soul in its journey to the underworld, which I thought was a pretty cool. The game had a lot of ritual and religious significance. It wasn't just recreational. So what are the kind of elements that we see in this game? It's a real-world game. It's in the physical world. Two players, and they played face-to-face across a table. And clearly, they talked about the game, and they were social, and they taunted each other. So there's some of the core elements that we saw there. Move forward, thousands of years. Most people will recognize this game. It's called Tabula. It's a Greco-Roman game that's the ancestor of backgammon. Again, same layout. Physical game board, two players face-to-face. One thing different in this carving, though, we have an audience member. Now, it may be a slave bringing libations, I'm not quite sure, but there is someone else watching the game, and that was something new. And then if you look at Go, which is one of also the other ancient games, this is from the Ming Dynasty. Clearly, and I love the expressions on their faces, there's several people that are not just playing the game, they're very interested in watching the game and seeing what's going on. The game has become a social thing. So what you saw really with these later games is the audience became more important as the games became less religious and more social. And of course, we all grew up playing these games. In the modern context, those same elements that have been around for thousands of years are there. The players are face-to-face. The game is a real thing in the physical world. And there's people watching on. We're having fun. So let's go forward to video games, the industry that we all work in and that we're familiar with. In the 70s, we saw the first commercial video games. This is a Japanese arcade with the cocktail machines. And if you're as old as I am, you remember these machines. They were basically designed to emulate a table where you could sit across from one another. Didn't see them as much in the US. They primarily were outside of the US, as far as I understand it. There's really two big innovations here. The first one is actually kind of conceptual. The game moved from being a physical thing into the world. It moved behind glass, and it became an abstraction, basically. And you interface with that abstraction via a controller. The other thing is, with the exception of Senet, where you could play your soul, These games actually can be played by themselves. You no longer needed two people. You could actually play the soul in the machine, the computer. And this is an arcade. Ironically, I just randomly Googled for a picture, and this is on Mercer Island in 1980, which is where I live, so I thought it was cool. I wish this arcade was still there. Anyone who grew up playing games in arcades, you immediately see those machines. You can remember what it was like to stand in that arcade and play awesome machines. Defender, Battlezone, Mooncrester, I remember, and I love those games. So there's another thing coming in here. The audience is coming in more here, and there was a couple of reasons for that. If you remember arcades, there was a scarcity of machines, and there was also a scarcity of pocket money. So a lot of the times, you stood shoulder to shoulder with other people watching a game, and you did that because A, it was social, B, you were waiting for your turn to play, and C, you were trying to figure out how to play better. It was a lot of fun. If someone was getting a high score, was going for it, there'd be a big crowd of people around them. And this really kind of is the basis for a lot of what we see in video gaming today. So, with video games, we've seen, now we have one or two players, we have this audience, but the games move behind glass. The controller and the primitive avatar is how we interface with the game. And then we're shoulder to shoulder watching someone else play as well. So in the modern context, what does that look like? In the modern context, that is Twitch and YouTube. It's the shoulder-to-shoulder experience of the arcade at industrial scale. This is a streamer called Markiplier on YouTube. I apologize in advance for putting the YouTube comments up on the screen because you're never supposed to read the YouTube comments. But what's he doing? He's playing a game, and there are thousands of people watching him. If you look at the number here, you can see that 678,000 people have watched him. So that's bigger than any arcade that's ever been built. But basically, we have the game content. We have Markiplier up here as the streamer. And then on the right, we have the social chat and community. And on YouTube, that is typically non-real-time social chat and community. So a lot of this is very familiar to us. This is the game content viewed through this window. We know the streamer. What's happened here, though, is the social chat and community has changed. What changed? It moved to text. It moved away from voice, and it's moved to textual feedback from somewhat anonymous people. These people, are not actually, maybe that's the person's real name, but most of these are anonymous. Likewise, let's go over to Twitch. This is Renee. She's a popular Twitch streamer. She's playing PUBG, of course. Everyone's playing that right now. So streamer, game content, social chat and community is the real-time chat window because chat is real-time on Twitch. Interestingly, that looks more like Egyptian hieroglyphics to a lot of people because Twitch has evolved its own sense of emotes and things like that. And again, it's very similar. It's a real-time text-based chat. So I believe actually the text-based chat and the anonymity is one of the challenges that we have to overcome. If something is on the screen and it's text and the person's anonymous, it's a lot easier to write something hateful and hurtful than it is to act that you would say to someone face to face. So, the game streaming platforms, what we've really seen is we're watching a game now, we're not playing a game. It's a little bit like being back in the arcade watching someone else play a game. The interaction model is different. It's one-to-many at a massive scale. But we have text interaction, which has much weaker emotional cues for us. And then we have this audience that's kind of mostly anonymous. And that can be the root of a problem. A lot of people do ask me, is that still a game? Is that some kind of different media thing? The answer is both. Games like PUBG are games, and they are also media. They are. If you don't understand that, then you shouldn't be making a game like that in this day and age. So let's go forward into our virtual future. Scott, you lined everything up perfectly for me. Thank you. Along comes VR. Now, there's some big changes here, and some of them are not immediately obvious. The game is no longer an abstraction. It's actually back in our physical world. Now, we know here that the game is actually behind glass in a headset, but your brain does not know that. Your brain thinks it's real. When a virtual spider crawls across your arm in VR, you jump. When you see a cliff in VR, your body has similar reactions to standing in a cliff in real life. It's good enough, the tech is good enough to fool our brains into thinking something is actually in the world. The other one is, yes, we're still using controllers, but these are different sorts of controllers than the little joystick we had when we started playing Pac-Man back in the 70s. These actually track the motion of the human body. And we have millions of years of evolutionary programming where we're very good at noticing the motion of people's heads and the motion of their hands. And when you see that in VR, your brain immediately understands that's a human, not a programmed animation. And then the last thing that's really interesting is, because we have something over our face, what can't we do? We can't type anymore. You could have a virtual keyboard, it would be pretty kind of clunky, and people have done that. But generally in VR, typing and text is not a way to interface. It is using your voice. And so we're going back to voice, which is an interesting return to what we've done in the past. So this is a VR game from my friends at Experiment 7. It's called Dungeon Chess. You can't really see it, but these characters are absolutely beautiful, and you can get down on the board and look at it. And I'm playing someone here. They're represented by an avatar of a fox, and you can see my hands using the Oculus touch controllers. And you know, just the motion of that person's head, and when they put their hands out and then they're moving things across the board, my brain immediately understands that is a person. I'm playing face-to-face, just like people were 5,000 years ago in ancient Egypt in the modern technological context. And interestingly, when you play the AI in this game, you immediately notice a difference, because the head and the hands, they don't move like a human being. They move like a programmed animation. This is from Rec Room. Cam spoke yesterday. It's a great social VR experience. You can play a variety of games with your friends. And again, you know, people underestimate the motion track controllers. Once I can see your head and hands move, and I can see a little bit of maybe some blinking and some mouth animation that syncs with voice, I'm convinced that's a person. And we've seen this. Someone mentioned this on a panel yesterday. You can identify people by the way they move. Even if you don't recognize the avatar, it doesn't have a name tag on it. In my office, Lizzie and Nikki are always doing dance moves. Sella likes finger guns. I do a lot of circles, allegedly. So, you know, I've watched people or met people in VR, and then later on met them in real life, and I feel like I already have a connection with those people. So it's very, very powerful technology, and I don't think we quite understand how important that is. There is a downside. Just like someone could come up and harass you in person if they were not a very nice person, in some ways, you can do that in VR as well. And I know Rec Room has on the kind of cutting edge of dealing with this. So you do need to understand that you have to protect people against people coming into their personal space and getting ahead of that and not recreating that kind of toxic culture we've seen in other places in gaming. My friend Eva has a really good quote. You'll excuse the profanity, but she says, social VR will not be awesome if it's populated with arseholes. So we've got to stop that. There's also another challenge, and ironically, you know, this is one that we're working on at VREAL every day, and that is, I've got this great VR experience, I've got a headset, but no one here has a headset, and I want to share it with you. And the way that we do that today is we take the headset video and we just pipe it onto YouTube and Twitch, and it looks like a drunk person with a camera. I mean, this is an exaggeration, but you guys have all seen those kind of videos. It's really disappointing when you see a great VR game and then you see a video of it that really doesn't represent what the game is. And it's not immediately obvious how to solve this problem, by the way. So a lot of great upsides to VR. You know, from the social perspective, we're returning to that real-world physical game environment. I think that has a lot to offer us. We have controllers and avatars that relate to the actual body of humans. They do not need to be CGI, photorealistic, like they stepped out of a movie. You saw the avatars in Rec Room. They're quite cartoonish, but they work. Our brains understand that that's a person. And we use our voice, which is pretty powerful. That creates what people are calling social presence, which is restoring a lot of the cues that I think we've lost in video gaming in recent decades. There are downsides, of course. Throw out everything you know about video game development, because all the UX and interaction model tricks that we use generally don't work, so development is challenging. The 2D interface is very difficult, and then we've got to get ahead of the negative behavior and try and reward positive behavior to stop harassment. So with that said, I want to show you a few things that we've worked on, and then maybe some ideas for your own VR development. So we think the ideal VR experience is not just playing. We think the ideal social VR experience is playing a game and watching a game at the same time. Social presence, deliver that by being in the environment with the player, with motion tracked avatars and with voice. Yes, they're expensive to develop and deliver on a scalable platform, but we think that is an investment worth making. This is one of the things that we've been innovating on, and that is really The audience needs to be present in the player's VR game with their own point of view. Not easy to achieve, but you really want to be inside the game with the player. And the audience then should control who they interact with and how. So if there's someone that really is harassing me, I need to be able to block that person and take them out of my sight. I really want to go in with my friends. It's a social experience that I would do with my friends. If there was a person at that arcade in the 80s that I didn't like, I wouldn't have hung out with them. And then, of course, how do we do the 2D content as well? A couple of things here. I stole this image from an HTC video. It's kind of interesting if you break it down. What have we got here? So we've got the person who's kind of the streamer, maybe, or the player. And then we've got the social chat and community on the couch here. And then there's some game content on the screen. And also the game content is in her headset. The problem is everyone here is compromising, right? This woman here is compromising because her friends obviously want to interact. She's got her hand up, but she can't see it. And if she wants to hear it, she has to lift her headphones. These folks here can't really experience what she's experiencing. They have to look over at the screen here. But there's actually another thing that's happening here that is interesting. I don't actually know Markiplier or Renee. If I go to Markiplier or Renee's house and sit on their couch, they're going to call 911. This model does not scale the way that we think of video games and streaming scaling. This is great because there's limited hardware right now, but how do we take this and actually turn it into a platform? So this is a game from Bossa Studios called Surgeon Simulator that we've done a lot of work with at VREAL. I apologize if you're squeamish. Some of these photos are a little gory. It's a comedy game. No one gets hurt. This is me playing the game. I'm on the right here, the guy with the surgical mask. And then this is my colleagues Nikki and Lizzie, and they're inside that game with me. They can move around. They can communicate. You can see they have motion-tracked hands, and the faces animate as well. But they have their own point of view on the game as I'm playing it. And they can control who they're in the game with, which stream they're watching, and likewise, I can control my interaction with them. So in this case, here is the audience, and here is the streamer and the player in the game. What's cool is, just like in the arcade, I could be watching someone's game, but then I could also walk off and have a conversation separately. They can go off in the corner. So in this shot, I'm actually off camera to the left here doing the surgery on Bob. But Lizzie and Nikki are able to actually go off and just have a social conversation together without necessarily being in a big chat room where there's a million things going on. And we actually allow you to change scale in this game. So in this case, they decided to shrink down, stand on the operating thing, just watch out for the saw. So that's a lot of fun. We've been playing with that a lot. How do I share that content with an audience that doesn't have a VR headset? So you notice on the ground here, there's a camera. There's a lot of ways to share the content. People are trying all sorts of different things. One of the things that we have found is that everyone knows how to use a camera. You give someone a camera and say, share this experience, especially millennials, they'll pick it up, they'll start Snapchatting, streaming it, and it's a great way for people to actually do that. The cameras are motion stabilized, and people know not to shake a camera, so they don't have any of the problems of a head cam that you would see in VR. And it's really interesting. If I give a camera to most people, they'll point it at the game or their friends like they would in real life. Give a camera to a streamer, the first thing they do is they turn that camera around and they point it at themselves. So we decided to do an experiment. We took Surgeon Simulator to a Twitch studio in Burbank, and they ran a 12-week season of a show called VR. And what they did was they actually set up cameras in that operating room. You can see the cameras here, and you can see all the viewfinders here. They had about 10 different shots. So, this is a small studio. They wouldn't be able to create something like this in real life. But in VR, they turned that game into an actual studio for their audience to watch a show. They had some judges that were judging the surgery, and that's the actual person playing the surgery. Now, initially, this was all going to be behind the scenes, and they were just going to see the show. And then one day we flipped to the wrong video feed when they were doing it, and they suddenly saw this panda, who's the camera person in VR, putting all the shots together, and it blew people's minds. So, of course, the Twitch audience, this is the guy's name is Lucas. They love Lucas. They love pandas, apparently, and they love this stuff. So it became part of the show. The panda became part of the show, just like when you watch The Tonight Show, he talked to the producers and the camera people. So this is Lucas in the real life. He started wearing a panda suit while they were filming the show, and they would occasionally show pictures of him as well. And if you look at the hieroglyphics, you know, the Twitch audience really loved it. I love this one. Nothing can go wrong with a panda in the operating room. It was pretty cool. So it was a great way to understand how we might do something with people in VR and get that out to 2D. So just wrapping up, you know, how might you take some of that experience? Oscar Wilde said there are three rules to writing the perfect novel. Nobody knows what they are. Here's my attempt for VR developers. Gaming is social. The best VR games are going to be social. I think we already understand that. From day one, you need to understand how you're going to deliver social presence in your game. Face-to-face presence for players and shoulder-to-shoulder presence for that audience. And avatars and voice actually go a long way to creating that kind of feel of a social game that people like. We think that you need to deliver an awesome VR experience. Obviously, we need more great VR content, but you also need to deliver an awesome 2D experience so people that don't have VR yet can really understand what you're talking about. And then ultimately, you've got to get ahead of the harassment issues and create a positive culture in your game early via both technological measures and moderation. So that's my thoughts on the future of gaming and social VR. Love to hear some questions, and if you'd like to contact me, that's my email address.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. I really loved it.
Thank you.
It's really great to hear more people talking about social VR, which I think is really exciting. It's kind of the most magical aspect of VR, where you can get two people kind of in a space together, even though it's not really a real space. In terms of presenting VR and being able to show VR gameplay to people who aren't in the world itself, have you seen the videos of people in green screen rooms where the sort of resulting video capture is actually seeing them in the virtual space, but seeing their actual physical bodies moving and doing the interactions?
Yeah, we've looked at green screen a lot. We have a green screen rig in the office. The challenge that we consistently see with streamers is they just don't have the resource to put up green screens, because you need to have a pretty high ceiling height. Like, they recommend 12 feet, and in our office, you know, we have 10-foot ceilings. So a lot of people struggle with that kind of production piece of it. And so we think that, I think it's a great tech and solves problems, especially for promotional trailers. But for long-term streaming, we would like to take people actually into VR for that, like, or have a camera that sort of feeds that out to the 2D world rather than relying on the green screen piece of it. So I think it's a cool tech. It feels to me like an interim tech towards something else.
So I'm not talking about sort of frame rate, but what's your experience of latency delay between sort of the kibitzers being in the room doing something, and then if they're having to interact with sort of people there?
Yeah, it does have to be closer to, you know, what we'd think of with a real-time MMO or something like that. Interestingly, you know, YouTube is typically not real-time, but Twitch, you know, has a 10 to 20 second system latency as well. You know, we aim to get sub-second latency. Once you can get close to that, I think people are pretty good with it. But it has some of the same scaling problems that you would have with a, you know, a big multiplayer game or an MMO or things like that. But so far, so good.
Well, Todd, I have a quick question for
Sure.
you. Again, from the lawyer's perspective, my clients who are doing this kind of work are always looking at how to monetize the game. And I was wondering if you had any comments about product placement in these games and how that might interfere with or enhance the game experience.
Yeah, I think, you know, if you look at Twitch and YouTube, anyone that has an entertainment product or a lifestyle product aimed at the gamer generation, which is, you know, pretty much anyone these days, they are actively looking for places to put products. So, for example, the VR show was sponsored by Akamai. We didn't have placement, but we had logos and things like that. There wasn't an actual product per se. I think folks are pretty open to that. That's the way that most streaming is done, is sponsored. I think what's nice about VR gaming is, for a lot of people, it's still a premium content opportunity. It's not freemium yet, and it won't be for some time. And that is attractive to developers that don't necessarily want to tackle the challenges of freemium and VR at the same time. Those things will come later. But from what we're looking at as a media and streaming platform, we think that, you know, advertising, sponsorship, subscriptions, all the things that you see on the streaming platforms today are equally applicable in VR.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you so much, Todd. We appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you.